welcome to another video here on the Critical Focus channel. First off, a big shout out to all my members who support my work and keeps the paint flowing and the electricity running. Members do get access to the member Discord, will influence the content, the matchups, whatnot. There is a join button below if you feel so inclined. But regardless, I am happy for your support in the form of actually just watching the video, of a like and a comment, and if you haven't already, please do feel free to subscribe as well. And if you are looking to buy Warhammer merch, there is an affiliate link in the video description as well. Let's get on with the video. Alright, so finally time to knock out the last review of the rival decks in the core box, and the mastery deck Countdown to Cataclysm is the most complex at face value, at least. What the mastery playstyle really is a little bit vague, as the warbands who have been tagged with this playstyle vary quite widely from, say, Mollog to Grandfather's Blessing. But nonetheless, it has some strong stuff in it, so regardless if you are in it for rivals or nemesis, you should consider some cards here nonetheless, given your warband. The plot cards for the Countdown to Cataclysm includes one with the text explaining the mechanic, as well as a tracker card that you advance with any generic token. Depending on where on the tracker you are, your Cataclysm value will be somewhere between 1 and 4. The tracker will advance the first time each round a friendly fighter is slain. Slain doesn't necessarily mean killed by an enemy fighter. You may indeed kill your own darlings or ping them to death to set this up, although in most cases I guess that won't be desirable. Also, and this is more important, in every end phase or immediately after the last power step rather, you check how many of the feature tokens has an enemy fighter on them, and for each that don't have one, you progress the tracker one step. So in most games I've played so far with and against this deck, you are usually at a value of 3 or 4 come the third round, so take that as a guideline, I guess. Let's check out the deck, starting with the searches. First up is a collateral damage, which is scored when you advance the tracker as a result of a friendly fighter being slain, or for any reason if you are the underdog. This is quite a good card that's been scored in most games I've played so far, but obviously it's more well suited for warbands with a lot of killable fighters rather than, say, Morgox or Droms or what have you. Too Close for Comfort, on the other hand, is a very aggro type card by its very nature. It's kind of the search variant of the old Eager for a Fight from Breakneck Slaughter, with each friendly fighter being within 2 hexes of an enemy fighter. Probably leave this one at home though if you are taking a bigger warband when you mix this one with, say, the whole deck. Shocking Assault is scored after your opponent's action step if you hold all the treasure tokens in neutral territory. I think that's quite a decent condition. Obviously the timing is the challenge here, as it's after the opponent's action step, but we are talking about most likely 1 to 2 objectives that are very easy to reach, and I think it's quite a solid objective as a result, even without a ton of fight. Nowhere to Run needs you to have a move charge token on all your friendly fighters and have a fighter in each territory. That includes the neutral territory. Probably best suited for a 5 to 6 man warband that have some out of sequence move tech, like we'll probably see on Hexbane or Canaans even in this edition. Rather easy to set up obviously with a 3-man warband, but drawing this card late is very rough for them. The perfect cut is succeed with an attack while the opponent rolls no successes. My experience is that this one is very easy to score. Most warbands have some 1 defense die fighters, and sooner or later they will whiff the save roll. Worth to note as well that if you have several weapon effects to choose from, say Grievous and Cleave, consider if the extra damage or the denying of a successful defense symbol to help the odds of this being scored is most important for that specific attack. Getting through your objective deck should always be pretty much your priority. Overwhelming Force. This is scored after a successful melee attack with 4 or more dice. I probably wouldn't take this if I am relying on, say, determined effort and the like to get to 4 dice. But if my warband includes a couple at least of survivable fighters that inspire fairly easy and goes to a profile with 4 dice, regardless of swords or hammers really, it is a decent inclusion. But otherwise, leave it at home. End phases then, Spread Havoc. It's simply gain glory equal to your Cataclysm value to a maximum of 2 in the end phase. So this is basically a guaranteed 2 glory in most games. Yeah, take it. Hounds of War is 1 glory if 2 or more enemy fights are slain and or damaged, and at least 1 was slain in the preceding combat phase. I mean, not an impossible condition, but we've seen a lot easier 2 glory end phases really, and this is just 1 glory. If you are a horde oriented warband, I would probably advise you to swap in another card from the whole deck, and for aggro mixes there's more reliable 1 glory in the strike deck even, so I'm not overly impressed with this one. Set Explosive is though 2 really solid glory for hold 2 treasure tokens, and at least all the ones in any of the territories. That includes neutral territory, so this is pretty much free glory really. At least if you have at least 4 plus fighters in your warband, I guess. Wreckers needs the number of slain or damaged enemy fighters to be higher than the Cataclysm value. This is nigh unscorable against some smaller warbands and even 4-man warbands as a late draw, where your Cataclysm might be 3 or 4, so even if it's painful to pass up on 2 glory end phases, I'm not convinced of the merits of this card. It's a bit too unreliable in my opinion. Uneven contest needs your warband to hold every odd numbered treasure token, so this is probably best taken if you mix with the pillage and plunder to delve a lot, as holding 3 specific treasure tokens might be quite the reach. So this card is sort of niche, but it's almost there. Lastly, we have Loaded for Bear, which needs any, so at least 1, friendly fighter to have 3 upgrades equipped. Super rough as a first round draw, and even as a later draw, mostly a good suit for fairly small warbands that tends to stack a lot of upgrades on single fighters. The few 1 glory end phases I take in a Nemesis, even if it were the first version of the game or this one, needs to be more reliable than this one and should always be scoreable in all of the rounds. I can live with a bit more gamble with my 2 to 3 glory cards, but the 1 glory cards needs to be pretty much out of score if your deck is to be competitive. Some strong stuff here, but warband type, this deck is so far a little bit all over the place, which is maybe intentional as the mastery tag is on fairly varying warbands, as I said, but I would have wished for a little bit clearer focus perhaps. Let's check out the Gambits. Savage Blow is a search ability for making an attack to count full surround symbols as successes in the attack. Decent, but I wouldn't cry rivers about leaving it at home in Nemesis, and don't waste it on a 2-hammer attack. Save it for when you're rolling 3 or 4 swords, preferably with single supports. Yes, I'm talking to you, Snurk. The End is Nigh is a double-edged sword type domain, which can still be fun to play if you already used up all your power cards, and even if you haven't, the odds are most often in your favor. After each action step, the player who went rolls dice equal to the Cataclysm value of 1 or 1 if they have no value. Do note then that it's not your Cataclysm value that decides how many dice your opponent rolls after their action step. They'll just roll 1 die unless they are playing the same deck and they have progressed their tracker beyond 1. Anyway, if the roll contains any swords or crits, that player's opponent must discard a power card. In the best of worlds, you get like 1 or 2 cards discarded from your opponents this way, and in worst case you'll get cards discarded and they won't. In either case, the effect is quite temporary as the domain goes away as soon as you progress your tracker. So yeah, I don't value this card greatly. If say you get 1 discarded card from your opponent, you've just about paid for the space this card takes up in your deck. It might sort of encourage your opponent to play their cards earlier than they would have wished, and not at the ideal timing maybe, to not risk discarding cards, but that's about it. I think the effect is a bit too weak. Growing Concerns is -X move in a single action step for enemy fighters, where X is the Cataclysm value, your Cataclysm value. Too temporary an effect and only really very situationally strong. Yeah, in some cases it might be very strong. In say the last round when the big scary enemy fighter with all the upgrades is sizing up a charge. But most of the time you won't be that lucky with your timing when you draw this card. Probably don't want to sit on this card for 2 rounds. And for the majority of your game, the X will be like -1, -2, and that won't generally do that much. Total Collapse, you roll attack dice equal to the Cataclysm value, and if any crits or swords show up, you pick a fighter and ping them. It's decent, ping is strong, just don't waste it while your value is still 1. It's just too unreliable then. If you choose a friendly fighter to ping, you can damage them equal to your Cataclysm value instead. If you, for example, need to kill off a fighter to score collateral damage, maybe a 0 glory fighter ideally. Violent Blast is a fun card, choose a stagger hex. There's 2 of them on both sides of the board. Push each fighter within 1 hex of the stagger token 1 hex. Pretty fun as it can push both friends and foes, and so on that merit I think it's quite a good card regardless. If you need to push towards your foes or against them to, say, set up an uncharged attack or something. Sunder the Realm is roll an attack dice for each fighter within 1 1 hex of neutral territory and ping them if any hammers or crits show up. As some of the strong end phase cards is sort of easier scored if you hold in the mid zone, this seems a bit counterintuitive. Of course, there will always be some situations where this might do more harm to your foes than to you, but I don't really fancy this one for the collateral risk. Raging Tremors is stagger an amount of enemies equal to your Cataclysm value. I don't value stagger as a weapon effect, but staggering ahead of time is quite nice. Kinda depends on where your focus is with your Nemesis pairing. Definitely a worthwhile inclusion for more aggressive pairings, but I'd probably skip it for Mastery Hold. Counter Charge is a rework of an old card, but quite different. Now you can simply react to an attack rather than a charge to push up with a friendly fighter other than the target to be adjacent to the attacker. Counter Charge is very good. And now even better, especially for putting your big strong fighters in aggro builds into the fray without charging. Do or Die is pick a friendly fighter and inspire that fighter. And it lasts X action steps. That includes your opponent's action steps as well though, keep that in mind. Where X is your Cataclysm value. So you won't get a lot of mileage out of this, then you uninspire that fighter and can't be inspired again for the rest of the game. Maybe situationally useful if you have a hard to inspire fighter with a low life expectancy that gains a lot from inspiring that you kinda wanna fire and forget, but I really struggle to see the general usefulness of this card. I would probably almost always leave it at home. Rounding out the ploys, we've got the Improvised Attack for an out-of-sequence attack. It's not a terribly strong attack as damage goes, although accurate, especially as a late draw. And it's a nice way of speeding up the Inspire for fast riders, if nothing else. Upgrades. Bringer of Doom means you get a double whammy on your tracker progression when this fighter dies, or for that matter if this card gets discarded for any other reason in a combat phase. I'm not sure if this is intended or not, but if your opponent forces you to discard this card from your hand, I guess this can trigger as well. Anyhow, I think it's a decent enough inclusion to give your tracker a bit of oomph, especially useful on the Bomb Brat, of course, as seen on the picture here. Visions of Ruin is plus X move, where X is the Cataclysm value, which is quite bonkers on Snark come second or third round, or you know, Moloch or whatever supercharged big burly fighter you have really. It does stagger you after a move, but what real warrior cares about that day? Extinction's Edge lets you advance your tracker one step if an enemy fighter is slain by this fighter. Pretty decent in aggressive builds with a centerpiece fighter. That does a lot of the heavy lifting. If though after using this your Cataclysm value is 2, the card that gets discarded. Not completely necessary card overall, and it won't make or break your game to include it or leave it at home really. Driven by Pain is heal this fighter after being driven back. Obviously a moot point if you're dead after that attack, but on a larger fighter that your opponent really wants to stave off and stay clear of them. It's a pretty fun card to make that decision a little less easy. Quite a fun design in my opinion. Not really useful if you plan to go the more hold route though. Inescapable Grasp and Snare. That's big snooze. Still better than before, but still not good enough to include even if it helps you score perfect cut versus dodged fighters. Utter Conviction is a real treat. Your defense is X, where X is, yeah, you've guessed it, your Cataclysm value. This is pretty wild late game or even mid game. It does come at the price of this fighter not being able to use critical weapon abilities though, but that's rather minor. Overrun and Stand Fast are just abilities, not weapon abilities, even if they trigger on crits after an attack, but does not count as weapon abilities and are thus not affected by this. Yeah, absolutely take this card. Burned Out lets you use an ability to stagger a friendly fighter and then draw 2 cards or 3 if you're the underdog. Sure, there's some strong cards to fish for here, but I'd rather just use the focus ability really than to stagger myself for a very similar end result. Great Fortitude, not much to say here. I've spoken on Great Fortitude many a times, and it's always worth the inclusion regardless of your playstyle. Maybe less so if you're playing a Horde warband, but generally those type of warbands also has 1 or 2 very important fighters, such as a leader that races fighters or pushes them around or something, so I think you will really never go wrong with Great Fort. Hurled Weapon is a 3 range, 2 hammers, 1 damage crit cleave attack, which is a nice inclusion for your big 3-man team of melee fighters to gain some ranged utility. Wouldn't bother with it in larger warbands though. Desperate Rage is on the other hand a fun weapon upgrade for those larger warbands with fighters with less fanciful strong attacks on their own. 1 range, 2 hammers, 3 whooping damage. torpedo your little goblin or skaven to much lament of your enemies. You do take a damage after using this attack, regardless if you hit or miss, but if your fighter has an expiration date that's due anyway, who cares? So yeah, that's it. A little less cohesive a deck than some of the other ones, I reckon, but it has some really good stuff to mix and match with the other decks for sure. I had great success with mixing this one with the hold for my Tsarbag's Gits, so maybe that's something you might try as well. And as I said, there's definitely stuff here for the more aggressively inclined smaller warbands as well. What do you think of the decks so far, and what ones have you fancied to be the strongest? So far I would probably rate them as pure rival decks goes, in this order. Number 1, Pillage and Plunder. Number 2, Emberstone Sentinels. Number 3, Countdown to Cataclysm. And number 4, Blazing Assault. So the Pillage and Plunder deck is probably the one best suited for all warbands, while I was really impressive with the end phases in Emberstone Sentinels. Countdown to Cataclysm here also has a pretty strong end phase with a good mix of cards for all sizes, but not with a clear enough focus, I guess, on its own. While Blazing Assault really struggles in the end phase, especially with that Annihilation taking up so much glory, while the other one glory end phases just don't cut it. I look forward to delving into the future rival decks though, as I foresee they will stir up this meta quite a bit. That is it for today. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.